As we dive into this discussion of the practice round, I wanted to offer you a couple of general observations as you think ahead to the real rounds. The first piece of advice I want to give you is that nobody wins the simulation long term in the first round. So, simply put, you can't win it in the first round. But the reverse isn't true. You can do significant damage to yourself in the first round such that you're going to have a hard time recovering. And as I go through the practice round results, I'm going to try to show you some of those areas where you can do such lasting damage to yourself that you have a hard time recovering. Uh, the second thing I want to point out to you is that the hardest thing about the first round is the uncertainty as to what everybody else is going to do. There's no good way to get around it. My advice to people is be somewhat conservative in the first round because you don't want to make one of the mistakes that's really going to cause you to do badly for several years. And I'm just kind of an advocate of knowing where you want to go, but taking a round or two to get there as you size up the competition. So, of all the decisions you're going to make, round one is probably the trickiest because you're not confident what the rest of the industry is going to do, and that's very critical. So, you can make your own assumptions. You actually know your classmates better than I do, so be aware of that. What I want to do is I want to look at a couple of past slides to introduce these points, but then I want to make one final point about the simulation, one very important part about the simulation. So this is a chart that I construct as the game goes on, where I'm tracking the key performance variables of everyone. I have lots of different charts. This particular one is just of earnings per share. The first thing I want you to see is that the team that finished in last place in round one later went on to lead in earnings per share, which is one of the most critical metrics that you will drive, all up until the last round. So, again, the point is this game isn't won in the first round. The team that won the first round was Team A, but you can see Team A then dumped into the cellar in the second round and stayed around the average and then finally got it together to make a significant jump in the last round. So the point is, it's not won in the first round, but I also want you to see what happens here to Team B. Now, you stay down here through a lot of bad moves, but notice they started bad and never got good. I want to reiterate that with looking at this other set of results. Again, you can see that the team that started well plummeted down to the bottom. So it's not about where you start, it's where you finish. And if you look at the blue team, this is where they started and then started to get their act together in the later rounds. The third point that I want to make is price wars are highly injurious. In every class, I try to talk my MBA students out of a price war, and almost every class I fail in doing that. And remember that a price war isn't just necessarily a price. You can say, hey, I didn't start a price war. I didn't cut my prices. I kept my prices the same. Well, but you did expand your models from 200 to 500, or you did take your shoe from a 5-star shoe to a 7-star shoe, and that changed your costs and you didn't increase the price. So it has the same effect as a price war. So I want to show you the tale of two classes. The first one I want to show you is one of the few classes that did not get into a price war. When you took over the company in year 10, your earnings per share was down here around $2. You can see in year 3, they moved that up as an industry. The hashed line is the industry average, and they continuously accelerated that over the course of the simulation. Notice that there were really two tiers of teams up here, and then the organ donors, so to speak, who were making their lives much better. Now, I want to contrast that with this performance. This is your classic price war. Remember, they took the company over at earnings per share of $2 a share. Round one, not bad. Didn't meet investor expectations, but not bad. And then rounds 2, 3, 4, and all that's going on here is a price war among them. Notice that nobody is getting particularly ahead. Nobody is meeting investor expectations. And then what happens is they begin to climb out of it. And usually what happens is the company, the way you get into a price war, it doesn't matter who initiates it. It only takes one team to initiate a price war. So if somebody goes out in year 11 and cuts their prices dramatically, everybody, no matter what they say, are going to think, okay, these people have thrown the hockey gloves on the ice. I've got to cut my prices to compete with them and to preserve my market share. And then, boom, it goes down. And then almost inevitably, it stays down for several rounds while people fight it out until eventually a team starts to assert a little bit of dominance, and then it begins to lead the way out of the price war. So you can see here the purple team jumped up, probably due to a price increase, although they were not the industry leaders, so that would be kind of uncommon. You're more looking for the blue team or the green team to lead the industry out. And you can see again, blue starts to pull up and pulls the industry with it, and everybody sighs this collective sigh of relief. Ah, so you'll hear me perhaps use this term. People want to bang the submarine off the bottom of the ocean. So here, when somebody starts a price war, it's like, and forgive the sound effects, aruga, aruga, dive, 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 as we just blow right down to the bottom of the ocean and bang the sub off the bottom of the ocean. These folks kind of banged the sub off the bottom of the ocean a couple of times until they were finally able to lead themselves out of the price war. When you take over this company, it is not hideously profitable. You are not a bunch of fat cats inheriting this company that can do really well by slashing their prices and increasing their quality all at the same time. You inherited a very reasonable company. I encourage you all to try to avoid a price war. Obviously, if somebody initiates a price war, people are going to respond. And best case, this is what it's going to look like. I've had a few classes that sat down here the entire time, and that's not a very fun thing to do. So with all of that introduction, let's get into the practice round. Got to move my screen over. Apologize for the delay. Here we go. So the first thing we're going to start with is the Footwear Industry Report. I'm going to talk very fast, so you may want to watch this video a couple of times to pick up the subtleties. So the first thing I do when I open this up is I see how did I finish. Today, I'm going to discuss myself as if I am Team F, and I'm also going to discuss the practice round as if I was very serious about it. Now, like I've told you, the practice round is nothing but the preseason, so the results aren't important. It's all about learning, but I'm going to talk as if we've taken it seriously. And as I look at the standings, I don't just look where I fall, but I kind of look what went on. So I had Team B that was clearly superior, and then a fairly big middle tier here in the 80s to 70s, not a huge jump to 65, but a little bit of a distinction there to I, and then these lower tier teams. To be honest with you, henceforth, I probably ignore H, A, and D. They're just not relevant because they perform so poorly that they're not really relevant. So I want you to remember this order: B, G, E. They're my big players. C is also a competitor. I'm F, and that's who I'm going to be focused on. The next several slides I don't need to dwell on because I've already gotten the key picture. Because guess what? Who finished first? B, then G, then E. Notice how closely the score correlates with earnings per share. Why? Because earnings per share is highly correlated with return on equity, is highly correlated with stock price. Now, there are some subtle differences between these that you're going to need to think about because they're important for corporate financial decisions. But if I look at one of these, I pretty much know what the others are going to do. Credit rating, remember, credit rating is important. The fact that I remove it from the scoring is simply because to get a high credit rating, you have to retire all your debt, and that's not necessarily the best thing to do. However, the higher your credit rating, the lower your interest rates, and that is important. So do not think that credit rating is not important. Image rating is also important. In fact, I'm going to change the scoring a little bit when you step into the real game. I'm going to go and raise this to 20% and cut the stock price from 50% down to 40%. Not a significant difference, but here's why. Corporate social responsibility investments only show up in the image rating. And so those of you that really want to invest in corporate social responsibility, again, typically it's easy to overinvest. You want to be careful. You can see that one team spent $9 million in corporate social responsibility, whereas the industry average was 1.8. they got 3 points added to their image rating. So it does help their score. You can do a sensitivity analysis yourself as to whether it really paid off. Bonus points, the thing that's interesting here is, did anybody get the Bullseye Award? Yes, they did. Team C got the Bullseye Award. Usually the way that you get the Bullseye Award is that you didn't play big in private label, or you guessed exactly correct as to whether your bids are going to be accepted, and or you sold every shoe you had available. And that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, and I'll point out to you that when we get later in the discussion. So C did get a forecasting award, good for them. I didn't, bad for me. Leapfrog Award. Now I start getting information that tells me not only how I did, but why I did. Superior material usage, if I see a consistent over or under use trend, that might be a signal of how I can build my shoe a little bit cheaper. These I just scan. Here, notice down here it says, hey, the industry is still in a condition of oversupply. There's still plenty of supply to meet the demand. I looked, anybody initiate new construction? Nope. Did anybody put their plants up for sale? Nope. Okay, those are key pieces of information that I would want to digest. Now, as I get into the financial information, I really am starting to get this feeling of how I did, and most importantly, why I did. So I'm F, 239 million, right around the industry average. Notice B, G, E, not always the industry leader in revenue, but often towards the top. I pay attention to this. There's not enough deviation here for me today to really worry about, other than I can look at A, why did they finish so poorly? Below average net sales revenues, but their cost of pair of shoe sold were way high, so I know they're right there kind of eliminated. Marketing expense, important. How do I fit in relation to the industry average? This 35 million is plenty. Sometimes companies want to get into marketing wars. I'm here to tell you, it is easy to overinvest in marketing and not get a lot of bang for your buck. Admin expenses kind of flow logically. Operating profit, that's a function of the math of these columns. Interest expense, if somebody incurs a lot of debt, I'll see that show up here. Income taxes, can't change those rates based on what your operating profit and your interest expense is. Net profits, again, look, B, G, E. Again, reinforces make money. Dividend policy, ooh, I see A and H, zero theirs. Notice they were two of the bottom performers. No surprise, they hacked off their investors, so their stock price took a hit. Let's see, C actually bought back a little bit of stock. Okay, that's interesting to watch. So did I. That's interesting to watch. So I come down here as F. I see, good, I finished with cash in the bank. That's nice. In fact, most of the teams did, which is really good cash management. Only E ran out of money and therefore had to get an emergency loan and pay a higher loan amount. So I'm happy with that. Again, you can look at things, who's picking up a lot of debt. There's a lot of good competitive intelligence that comes off of this. What are people doing to their dividends? Lastly, down here to these operating ratios. These can be a little misleading. In other words, you would think you would always want to have the lowest percentage on cost of pair sold. Yes, but ... sometimes not. And that has to do with your strategy. So all of these things can feel like, oh, I've got to be the lowest ones, except operating profit. You obviously, net profit, you want to be the highest ones, but not always. So it fits in with your strategy. This is a hugely important indicator, days of inventory. I'm looking for somebody that did not sell the shoes they had. Team E has 90 days left in inventory. This is not what they want. It's much higher than they want, but it's not egregious. If you mess up your forecast in round one, you could see yourself with 150 days of inventory. And this hurts going into the subsequent years because this excess inventory has to be gotten rid of somehow. So I pay attention to this, hoping, first of all, that mine's reasonable and mine's perfect, indicates I probably sold out of every shoe that I intended to sell. But I also have to know who's likely to be very hungry and very aggressive. And so E, even though they finished in the top round, in the top tier in this past round, going to be hard for them to stay there because it's a lot of shoes they're going to have to contend with. Performance benchmarks. This is one of the most important pages in the industry report because as the instructor, I don't have this column, but in yours, you have a column that lists exactly what your numbers are, and that's important. For example, I look over here and say labor costs in North America. Notice that the industry high is $6.15. So whoever had the low to high had a $1.14 advantage in their shoes. However, that's awfully high, and it's awfully high above the average, which makes me think we had one team that kind of blew it and had a very high average that skewed this up. But I pay attention to that. I pay attention to my reject rates. I pay attention to what other people are investing in Six Sigma. Total manufacturing cost, again, you have to consider your shoe. If I'm building the best shoe in the industry, I'm not going to have the lowest manufacturing cost. If I'm building the best shoe in the industry in terms of SQ and number of models, and I'm much above the industry average, I'm thrilled if my costs are down here right around the industry average, because I should be able to price it up. Then when I come down here, again, a lot of good competitive information. These operating profits are really key. So this is where I'm really looking to see how I compared both in the branded segments and in the private label segments, where you see people that sold shoes at a loss in the private label. You wonder why. You priced them. Why did you price them in a way that would cause you to sell them at a loss? Um, and then lastly, celebrities. Wow, 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 wow. A got a huge advantage for future years because a $550,000 contract is very cheap. And they got a celebrity locked up at that price for 5 years. So if this were to continue, A would have a pretty big advantage. You can figure out exactly what a celebrity is worth to you by going into the branded sales forecast. I think I talked about that earlier, but I can tell you $500,000 a year is really, really cheap. And then I'm not going to talk about them, but this is a nice thing to look at just to see what the trends are, what's happening in the industry. So you can see I've gotten a lot of information from the Footwear Industry Report. I primarily focused on the how I did, and I've gotten some good information on why I did. Next up is going to be the Competitive Intelligence Report.